a parable that Jesus told, and this is one of only a few parables that Jesus then later on goes and explains. And so here's the explanation according to Jesus. This is him speaking. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the world, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word and yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. Friends, may God add God's blessing to the reading, to the hearing, to the understanding of God's holy word. Thanks be to God. Amen. You may be seated. So before we jump into talking about our text for today, I want to remind some of you were not here last week when we started our series. And we started a series called Scripture Comes Alive. And so we began by giving out talents based upon the story of the parable of the talents that we read in the gospel. Of one given 5 talents, one given 3 talent, one given 1 talent, and the 5 talent person turns it into 5 more, the 3 talent turns it into 3 more, and the one person goes and buries it, returns it with just the 1, and you sort of remember how that story plays out. So we gave out talents, and a talent was simply an envelope that had a $5 bill. And at the end of our series, we're going to come back together and we're going to talk a little bit about what was produced. And you're going to be offered a chance to come and to bring back that talent, hopefully multiplied in some sort of way. I've already started seeing pictures that some people have done of the ideas that they have of what they're going to use their talents for, crafts that they've made that they're going to sell, or pictures or things like that. If this is something that you want to still do, even though you weren't here last week, based upon the numbers, that's quite a few, you can get a talent today. I can give you one. I've actually got some of our leftovers from last week. If you want one of those as you walk out today, simply let me know, grab one. I'll place them in the back in one of those chairs, and you can grab that. And I don't need to know any more about that. I don't need to know where you were last week. I just need to know, you need to know that we miss you when you're not here, and that you're still able to participate in this. And again, we will celebrate it at the end on July 12th. That'll be our last Sunday in which we talk a little bit about this. But this week we're talking about these seeds. And when I originally put this together, we came up with this idea of giving seeds out. And so you'll have an opportunity at the end during the hymn of response during our closing hymn, which is a shorter hymn, so you're going to have to do this a little quicker than you did last week. You'll have the opportunity to come forward and to grab a pack of seeds that you can plant. We'll talk about that in a second. And so when I was thinking about this, I thought, man, I got to come up with I need to find a passage that really kind of emphasizes the seeds and what happens when we were planted for God. And this was the passage that came to mind. Jesus talks often about scattering seeds. Jesus was somewhat of a master gardener in his parables and in the metaphors that he taught using. And then I started to read more and more about this text, especially this past week, and I realized that it's not about the seeds at all. It's about the soil. And that you and I, and that others, have to be the soil for which God is planting in. And I thought, I'm not bringing in a bag of soil for people to take home. So we're going to stick with the seeds this morning. Because I think we are seeds, and we have an opportunity to plant seeds, but at the same time, we're also the ground in which the seeds are planted. And so I want you to hold up these 4 things, really. I want you to hold up yourself as a seed yourself as the ground, but then I also want you to hold up people that you know as also being the seeds of God and of Christ, and also people that you know as being the different kinds of soil or the different kinds of ground. So what we need to know before, even as we get started, is that Jesus often taught in parables. Parables are simply stories, and odds are these stories. This is gonna startle some of you. Odds are these stories didn't literally happen. They never were intended to actually really happen. So if you get really upset about the prodigal son actually not really happening, you're missing the point. They were stories told to convey a deeper truth about life. And let's be honest, we like stories. I mean, some of us actually like to read stories still. Some of us like to watch them on screen. Some of us like to watch them on a small screen. The screen seems to be getting smaller and smaller because I can now watch stories on my phone. But we like to watch these stories. We like to be told stories. So Jesus knew that. Jesus knew that that would appeal to us and that we would grow in deeper truths by telling stories. And so Jesus told a lot of them. We call them parables. And what we need to know about parables is that the majority of the time, and I've told you this before, but the majority of the time, parables point us to God. This again is sort of shocking to some of us because we open up the Bible and we read it and we go, yep, this is all about me. Me. We do that with a lot of our lives if we're honest with ourselves. The parables are first and foremost about God. They're first and foremost about. We always have to keep that in mind. And so before we even start talking about seeds and soil, we have to celebrate the fact that the sower is even present at all and that God is the sower in our lives, planting us and tending us. That's where we start. But we do have a part to play in the parable for today. We do have a part. So let's look at the four types of path, or the four types of surface that the seeds are planted on. The first that we are told about is that the seeds were scattered on the hard path. So there was really no ground at all for which to receive the possibility of new life with these seeds. Instead, it fell on the hard path. I think when I hear these words, or think when you hear these words, to the hard hearts that people have. The people have hard hearts. Some of us have hard hearts at times, and that's simply because life has sort of beat us down. And time again, we sort of have heard the same thing over and over and over again, and our hearts have kind of hardened to life, and we're not very sympathetic or apathetic towards the needs of others because it's just sort of like, oh, here we go again. I'll confess, I think about this sometimes when I pull up to an intersection here in Charleston and I see yet another person standing out with a sign. And my heart's been hardened at times because I've interacted with a lot of people who are homeless, and I know not everybody who does it is honest. And so in my more vulnerable moments, I simply sort of fold my arms and say, ugh. And I think God's heart breaks again because I've hardened my heart. And I think if we're honest, and let's be honest, I think if we're honest, that sometimes the church is responsible for hardening people's hearts. Because people have come into a church, into a group of people who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, but yet who act anything like that. Trust me, I just was with a whole bunch of clergy this past week. I could tell you some stories about these men and women. We didn't always act the most Christ-like. And so people see this, and their heart sort of almost calcifies a little bit. And it makes it hard for them to receive the love of God that God has in store for them. So if you find, here's the word of warning, because all of this is going to be promise and warning. So here's your warning. If you find your heart being this way, start praying more diligently. God, please soften my heart. And when you do that, also keep in mind that when you interact with somebody who has a hard heart, who seems to be really tough and difficult to deal with, realize that it's not all about you, that they've probably had that hard heart because of something somebody else has done or said. And so we practice a little bit of grace. We'll come back to that word in a second. Secondly, rocky ground. So we're there, and the seed is cast, and there's rocky ground. That there is ground there to be received, but it sort of hits the ground, and it kind of gets down in between the rocks, and it's planted, and it pops up real quick. But it doesn't have any place for the root to go. And so it dies off very quickly. I think of people who have a shallow faith when it comes to this rocky ground. And again, I think if we're honest, we admit that sometimes this is even us. Like sometimes every now and then, I hope you hear a good word, even if it's not from this pulpit, it's from another pulpit, and you get all excited about faith, and you go home and you go, I'm going to make a difference, I'm going to make a change. And then Monday morning comes. And it's hard. Because you got a lot of appointments, or because the kid's been up in the middle of the night, or because you just really weren't committed to begin with. And so our faith sort of is a little shallow. We're not willing to go very deep. And some of us are just plain lazy at times. Somebody tweeted out this week, somebody I followed, it was actually yesterday, a Lutheran pastor named Nadia Bowles-Weber. She tweeted this out. She said, I wish I knew the difference between being tired and being lazy. I wish I knew the difference between being tired and being lazy. Because I'm thinking that's a pretty fine line, right? I mean, it is in my life. And I think that's rocky ground. That is like, we take youth on trips sometimes, and we'll go on retreats or we'll go on mission trips, and the youth will be all fired up, and they'll be excited about coming home and really ready to set the world on fire. And then like Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday happen, and they're like, okay. We call those mountaintop experiences, and we have those, but it pops up and then it fades away very quickly. So that's the rocky ground that Jesus was talking about. Lastly, or thirdly, the negative, the last of the negative kind of soils, he talks about it having among thorns, that it's scattered among the thorns, and the thorns choke the life out of it. And I don't have to really break this down at all, because in his explanation, he says it's the wealth and the craving of monetary wealth. That's what chokes out the love of God in our lives and in the lives of others, and doesn't allow us to fully live into what God would have us to be. Years later, after Jesus was with us on earth, a man named Paul was writing to a dear young man who he was mentoring in the faith, Timothy, and he wrote to Timothy. He said, Timothy, you have to be aware that this is going to happen, that the love of money is the root of all evil. Notice he said the love of money. It's not the money, it's the love of that money. See, because Paul knew this, because Paul, the man who had that life-transforming experience, learned from Jesus' own words that said, you can't love God and money. And so in our lesson, we have to make sure that we don't have a divided heart, that we're so diligent in focusing on money that we lose focus of God altogether. And listen, friends, we are in the most consumeristic, materialistic society that has ever existed. Maybe. I don't know. I'm not a historian, so I don't know that for a fact. But it feels that way. It feels that way. It feels like everything's about purchasing, buying, having this, that, and the other. That's the thorns. That's the thorns that sometimes you and I are planted as these seeds are planted in this world. And then lastly, the fourth type of surface is the good soil. Of course, the good soil, the soil that has been cultivated by God, that can yield and can produce good fruit, the kind that is absolutely ripe for growth. This is what we hope and this is what we desire. And honestly, friends, in our best days, this is us. That at some point in your life, you are the good soil. You had to be because you're here in this place. That you had a transformative experience. And it may have only been for a little while, but it was enough for today to bring you to this day. And see, all of this, what starts out as a simple parable about soil and seeds and a sower. And if you really, really dive deep into this, if you really sort of try and figure out what is exactly going on, you come to the conclusion that Jesus is sort of talking about the meaning of life in general. He uses a story to talk about the meaning of the life, or better yet, to just say, what's the use? What's the use? And we know the use is to produce fruit. That's how they'll know we are Christians, is by our love. We sing that periodically. It's to produce fruit in the world around us. Because God's planted a seed within each and every one of us and calls us to be the same seed for the world. I recently heard a response to the question, what is the meaning of life? Now, again, I'm going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 words. I'm going to summarize it in 10 words. Here you go. I'm going to summarize the meaning of life in 10 words. No, this isn't going to be a complete and total thing. This is something that I like. I heard and I like and I appreciate it, and I've thought over it and I've pondered it, and I've tried to break it down a million different ways to make sure that it's not perfect. But it's still pretty good. And so the meaning of life is this. Could possibly, potentially be this. To humbly and proudly return what you've been given. I mean, if you're going to write something down, like there's a whole piece of paper, this would be something to write down. I probably should have put it on the screen so you can see. To proudly and humbly return what you've been given. Just think on that this week. If nothing else. I mean, you don't have to think about anything else this week. Just think about that. To proudly and humbly return what you've been given. Because where I keep coming back to when I think about this, when I think about what proudly and humbly return what I've been given, the word that keeps coming back to my mind is simply grace. As United Methodists, we're big on grace. And that's what I keep coming back. That I've been given grace through and salvation through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And my aim in life is to return that grace to others. To give and to offer that grace with others. Now, that means that when I encounter people in this world who are hard-hearted, who are thorny people, yeah, we know some thorny people, and who are, what's the third type? Who also are rocky, hard, thorny, that I give them a little bit of that grace as well. That I don't give them such a hard time as I would have before, because I've come to an understanding that I've humbly and proudly receive grace through God. Now this ain't easy. This is hard. Because this means we're not going to get recognition. This means that we sort of have to turn the other cheek. This means we have to forgive our enemy at times. This means that we may need to make amends with people who've hurt us. That's hard. Again, years later, after Jesus, that same man named Paul was writing to another group of friends. And in his letter, he says this to the Hebrews: "For God is not unjust. He will not overlook your work and the love that you showed for his sake." And so all the difficult stuff that we do, as we humbly and proudly return what we've been given, that doesn't go overlooked. It may not mean that we don't get thanked as often, we don't get praised, but it may mean, it definitely means that God sees what we do. That God sees what we do. So in that same chapter that Paul wrote, he writes these words. He wrote these words as well. And this is a few verses before that. He says, ground, and see if this sounds familiar, because again, Paul focused on Jesus and Jesus' words. Ground that drinks up the rain falling on it repeatedly and that produces a crop useful for those whom it is cultivated, receive a blessing from God. But if it produces thorns and thistles, it is worthless and on the verge of being cursed. Its end is to be burned over. See, Paul knew this. Paul knew the warning and the promise because he had learned from Jesus. Jesus came and he taught this to us still today. So friends, this week, here's what I want to offer you a chance to do. I know some of you are gardeners. I know some of you are pretty good gardeners. Some of you like flowers. Some of you like vegetables. Whatever it is you like. We're going to give you a chance at our closing hymn as we sing this hymn for you to come up and to snag a packet of seeds that you can get. Bachelor button. I've never even heard of that before. Anyways, packets of wildflowers. There's some radishes, there's pumpkins, there's peppers, there's all kind of different flowers. And I want to invite you to take these and to plant them as a reminder to yourself that we are seeds to be planted in the world. I told the first service, it wouldn't even hurt my feelings if you did a little guerrilla gardening and you went in your neighborhood to a place that was sort of ugly and tended it up a little bit and planted some wildflowers there. Maybe even your neighbor's yard. I mean, don't pick a fight with your neighbor or anything like that, but something that could even possibly feasibly bless someone else. And yeah, you're going to have to work a little bit. Somebody walked out today and went, man, you gave us more work to do. Yeah. And if that work reminds us that we have to work in the world for God and with God, and if that work that you and I engage in actually produces something that makes the world a little bit more beautiful, I'm okay with that. And you are too, right? Friends, as the seeds of Christ, as the seeds of Christ, be planted, be cultivated, so that you may grow into the fruit that God wants you to be and that the world needs you to be. Amen.